Welcome to part 2 of this series where I'm taking this model of Punchy, the Hawaiian punch guy, out of Nomad and into Blender and getting to this final render. After this video, I'll have a short bonus video where I pull it in to my Looking Glass hologram device and show them off in 3D. So when I first pull the model into Blender, what I do is I first pull in an HDRI. This is an HDRI backdrop I got off of from Polyhaven, I believe, and I just temp that in, and then I go through and I set my camera, my output format to a square format, because that's usually my intended format for these, because I usually post a lot of the stuff on social media sites such as Instagram. And then I go through and I start assigning shaders and consolidating all the materials down, because once you output the GLTF from Nomad and bring it into Blender, it has like a different material for everything. So I'm going through and I created a skin shader that I call M_skin, and I'm assigning that to all of the pieces of him that use skin. The main goal when I'm taking a sculpt here from Nomad into Blender and making it look nice is I usually try, when I set up my shaders, to avoid having to use any sort of UVing. So most of the tips and tricks I use are procedural tricks, and I'll be using vertex color, if anything, which was already set up in Nomad. So the skin shader, it takes the vertex color information, and then I tweak the roughness and I add in some subsurface in there to get it looking good. Subsurface in cycles, Blender cycles, looks so good. And sometimes I'll pull a shader from Blender Kit, or I have a couple other shader libraries such as Sanctus that you'll see me use here. And sometimes I'll try those out. So this is my Sanctus library, and it's got like some glass and water shaders that I'll try to use on the Hawaiian Punch. And same with the sand. Now, I did throw the sand shader on here from Sanctus, and I like it a lot, but it is actually reliant on UVs, which is fine, because I'm actually eventually going to get rid of this little sand clod here and put a new plane in, or a grid mesh from Blender, which already has UVs on it, and use that. So that makes that process simple. So that is the one object I am using UVs. Everything is going to be sped up here. This isn't meant to be an in-depth Blender tutorial, just like my Nomad videos. Rather, it's supposed to be more of a workflow overview. One of the things I'll do is I go into my environment backdrop, and I set it up to where only the light path rays or whatever of the HDRI backdrop figure into lighting. So, and then all the other ones that the camera sees are just a color. And so that's what I'm setting up here. I use a mix shader to control those. You know, I can go into more in-depth with that in the comments below if you guys are curious. It's a pretty common technique, though, if you've done much Blender work. And you'll see I added a mapping node as well on that HDRI just to rotate it and get the lighting into place. And so now I'm going through and I'm actually kind of dialing in that lighting. And so I've got the lights that are already there from GLTF, but the values are never quite what they need to be for setup and render in Blender. So I adjust intensities and colors and try to get those blocked in. Eventually, a lot of this is going to change. So for backdrop, what I decided to do here is I wanted a beach scene. And so this is one of those times where it's I'll use something like Midjourney to really easily create a backdrop. It's going to be blurred, and it's not really going to be the focal point, but it goes a long way to add some atmosphere and color. And I went through a process of Midjourney of kind of finding that background. I pulled it in as just a plane and made sure it's an unlit plane. And now I'm going in and I brought in a grid mesh from Blender, and I'm using some sculpt tools to give it some depth and shape for the sand that he's standing on, and I'm replacing that sand cloud that he had. Once I do that, I'll throw the Sanctus sand material back on, and again, the mesh, the grid mesh in Blender already has UVs on it, so I don't even have to worry about that. It keeps things very simple. And so Sanctus will do a better job of getting the grain sizes and stuff the way I want them. And so here you can see I'm dialing in the size of that grain, and all those attributes are set up and twinkable. It's in a plugin form. You can purchase those shaders. They've really done me a lot of good. I used them on the Captain Crunch illustration you can find on my Instagram if you've had a chance to check that out. I did a lot with the Sanctus shaders. In fact, the Sanctus shaders or Sanctus materials were a big reason I did the Captain Crunch the way I did it, just to try those out and play around. All right, one other trick I do is I'll create an empty, I call it focus, and then I'll take my camera and I will set my focus point to be that empty, and then I'll pull my depth of field way down, pull the aperture way down so it's got a really shallow depth of field. And that way I can move that empty just around to get it right where I want. Usually when you're setting focus, a good idea is just right at the nose of the character. So that's currently where I have the focus. Although this one does get a little tricky because his fist comes so far into the foreground. So now I want to play with some procedural tricks with the shader on his hat. So one of the tricks I'm going to do is I'm using the pointiness node in the shader network, and I'm plugging that into a color ramp and dialing that in so I can get a lot of contrast in the cavities. This is like doing a cavity map or a curvature map in another program. And you can see just playing with this color ramp and the positions of the white and black points on the pointiness, you can get some really interesting effects. Again, both kind of a curvature, you can get like an edge effect, or you can get the cavities in there. So here I've got the edge that I'm using, and I'm using that to kind of color mix to where it lightens the edge, and then I'm multiplying the cavities in there so it darkens the cavities. So that really just kind of enhances, you know, the worn wood look here. Again, it's something like you might do something like that in Substance. But in addition to that, I do need to add some texture, and I'll eventually go in and add some procedural texture. Before I get back to the hat, though, I'm going to add some procedural texture to the shirt. And I'm going to do that using, again, just the generated texture coordinates, and then I'll throw on the procedural brick texture. And I'll play around with that with a mapping node, rotating the coordinate mapping just where it makes sense from this camera angle. Usually this trick won't work from, like, you know, turning the model around, but when you're just using one camera angle, you can usually get it to work well enough. And then I scale the bricks way down, I plug those into a bump node. And what that does is gives it a little bit of a cloth weave look. This is something I do a lot when I'm doing these Blender renders on, if you've seen some of my other Nomad to Blender sculpts, you'll see me use this trick a lot. And similar to the way I was using the pointiness node, you can also use an ambient occlusion node, plug it into a color ramp, and then multiply it with the main color just to bring out some of the ambient occlusion. And I'm not sure, for a while you couldn't do that in Eevee. I believe this does work in Eevee now. I'm not quite sure on that. But sometimes you may have to go in your render settings and mess with the ambient occlusion settings there before this will work, I believe. All right. All right, and so the other thing I wanted to do is add a little bit of a noise bump, and this is just using noise texture to the skin. So it's got a little bit of a bumpy, porous look to it. Punchy has kind of a Muppet look to him. So, you know, I would say his skin can be part skin, part kind of soft, fleecy looking. Either way, it needs kind of a small, noisy bump, something that you typically wouldn't sculpt, but you would definitely want in the texture. You could, of course, sculpt this detail. It's just then you end up with a really high-res model, and you know, I just don't know it's a lot of times it's a judgment call, how close the camera is going to get to a subject on how much needs to be sculpted and how much can just be done in shader work. So here you can see I plugged it into the bump. After the first thing I do is I plug the noise into the color so I can see what it's going to look like. Then I plug it into the bump when I know I've got the size right, and then I pulled the bump intensity down just so it's barely there. I'm also going to use ambient occlusion on the head, so that way on stuff like kind of in the creases of the mouth it gets darker and it's not as lit up, and it will, and you can see even in the creases of his fingers there, the ambient occlusion really helps pronounce those curves, because once you get a lot of subsurface on a shader, a lot of times you'll lose a lot of those deep crevices. They kind of brighten up and you lose the contrast there. So the ambient occlusion node can kind of help take care of that. So this is me messing with one of the Sanctus glass materials for the Hawaiian Punch. And you know, I tried a few things here, both using Sanctus and using just a regular glass material, and I think what I ended up doing is just using the glass material from Blender. I believe that's what I've got going on here. However, I think at the end I actually do switch it back because I was getting some weird artifacting in the reflection on the right. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to do was paint some extra vertex color and give some pink to the eyes, as well as some dark circles around the bottom of the eyes. And so I can do that by simply plugging that color into the material, which is already set up, the vertex color into the material, but then go into sculpt mode and you can modify the color. So here I am just adding in some pink using sculpt mode, and you know, Blender has really come a long ways in terms of just the speed that you can paint the vertex colors. Ever since it got implemented into their sculpt mode, it works wonderful. So here I am just using some soft colors, some soft brushes. I got the pink in the eyes, and now I'm adding purple under the eyes. And you can see in the same way that the lashes on the lids serve to create some contrast and shape to his eyes, the pink and the purple do the same thing here. And again, I think it really adds to that kind of punch drunk look to him. So at this point, I'm continuing to just tweak the shaders, trying to get them exactly the way I want. I know this video is sped up. If there's any questions you might have, just feel free to comment below, and I can try to answer those in as much detail as I can in a comment. You know, again, this isn't a very detailed walkthrough. However, it's more just kind of showing the process, how I get from the Nomad render to the Blender render. All right, so here is a plugin, an add-on that I just got. Man, this thing got me really excited, and I was just looking for an excuse to use it. This plugin is called Mossify. Spent a little money on it. There is a free version out there. I highly recommend you check it out. It's just really, really cool plugin that more or less is an asset library, and the asset library uses geonodes to scatter moss and all sorts of kind of greenery around an object. And you can even customize the moss and put your own rocks and ferns and foliage in there. So what I'm doing here is I created a vertex group on the sand, and I vertex painted, I weight painted it. And eventually I figured out that it doesn't like the smooth weight paint as much. You're a lot better off if you use Mossify to just select the vertices and do a weight and just manually assign a weight of 1 or a weight of 0. And then you use Mossify to pick out that vertex group and spawn the moss around it. So I did a little bit of playing around, a little bit of troubleshooting where I was trying to weight paint it. And you'll see me go back and forth. But eventually I figured, again, the best way to do it is manually assign them. But this was really cool. There's all sorts of really cool moss assets that you can pull. There's different what he calls biomes that have different looks to them, and it's all customizable. And so I use this to create a lot of kind of greenery and rocks. So even though the sand's there, it's this really lush beach, kind of like you see in the background there. And, you know, a good part of this you're seeing is just me messing around and experimenting until I find something I like. There's lots of different pieces of greenery. There's mushrooms and stuff that you can just, all you do is just throw it into your scene and you add it into the collection, and it will populate around on the plane. It's kind of like a PCG volumes if you use Unreal, it kind of reminds me of, but it's all done through geometry nodes. And even the plants themselves are built off geometry nodes. So you can even take one of these individual plants and go into the settings, and he's got a whole list of attributes to go through. I think I spent maybe $50 on this plugin. It's amazing the amount of content you get from it. So you'll probably start seeing me use a lot of this in future renders. I definitely am interested in finding more and more ways of implementing this plugin. And I'll put a link to the Mossify plugin in the description of this video, so you can go check it out yourself. Here I am playing with the weight paint, and it wasn't quite getting there. You might see that I'll weight paint and I switch it back and it looks like the moss is still everywhere. Again, I eventually figured it out, but you know, I always tell people a big part of 3D animation is troubleshooting. I would say 80% of it is troubleshooting. So you're seeing me do that here. All the more reason to speed up these videos. So here I am manually selecting the vertices. Again, this is the way to really apply Mossify with vertex groups. Manually selecting vertices with the circle select tool and assigning a weight of 1. And you'll see once I do that, the Mossify shows up exactly where I want it. Not really sure why weight painting wouldn't give me the same result. If you know, feel free to comment below. I would love to know. And maybe it's just not the way it works. I don't know. So I've got some flowers in there, and they are in the extra asset collection in Mossify. And so you can do a little bit more. It's got some very specific tweaks that you can do to the extra assets in terms of size and stuff. Really, when I do these illustrations, it's just a matter of like, how far can I go with the detail and how far do I want to go with the detail? I eventually end up deciding to add in like a Hawaiian punch box that I just model. So I do that just by making a cube. And man, I do this really quick. This is one of the things that makes Blender so awesome. You just think of something and just in a matter of minutes, you can have it together and looking amazing. So it's just a cube. I add some loops and I move the loops around to make it bent. And then I went and found just a Hawaiian punch box. I guess it's a texture, but it was like an image that someone had posted online. It was kind of an older school Hawaiian punch juice box. And I grabbed that and then I just mess with the UVs so it matches up with the texture in the way I like. So here I am creating the texture of the box, and then I will pull in the image that I found. And here I can just go in, I can grab the individual faces of the box, and I can push and pull them to where I get the label lined up in the way I need it to show in the illustration. And so for the most part, you're just seeing 3 faces of this cube. You're seeing the front and then the bottom and that left side. And so once I get the UVs the way I want them, this is where I add in the loops and I just kind of distort the box a little bit, crunch it up so it doesn't look too pristine and perfect. So really quick to add this detail, but I think it really adds a lot to the illustration too. And then I use a bevel modifier so I don't have these CG crisp edges. had the left side UVs were turned around the wrong way, so I have to turn those back around. Once I do that, I will create a cylinder for the straw, make it red, and kind of do the same thing, just kind of move it around the way I need it. A cool trick that I use a lot in Blender is the 3D cursor. When I first started working with Blender, I didn't really know what to do with a 3D cursor, but once you figure it out, it's really handy, because what I can do is I can select the face, and I can set the 3D cursor to the face, and from there, when I generate the cylinder, it shows up right at that 3D cursor, and so it really beats creating a cylinder at the world origin and having to move it into position. It makes it a lot easier. I guess I didn't use a cylinder here. I'm just using the Bezier curve. So similar to the tube tool in Nomad, but I do like the Nomad curve tool better. But you can see it's really easy to add in a bend and just get that straw looking good. And what I decided to do after that is I went ahead and threw that box into a collection. Collection is another one of those Blender gems I didn't know what to do with, but now that I've learned how to use them, I love them, I use them all the time. And so then I can just instance that collection into the scene and throw another box there on the right. From here, we're getting really close. I've got all the main elements of my illustration in. I'm just continuing to tweak and refine some of the stuff. Here I'm playing with some of the other fun assets in the Mossify plugin, bringing in some more exotic elements. He even has some fireflies in there. And this is actually from his underwater biome, I think. But just to bring some more color into the scene. Okay, and so finally coming back to the hat, I wanted to add a little bit more fine wood grain to the hat. So what I did is first I threw in a brick texture and used the generated texture coordinate, plugged it into mapping, and used that mapping just like I did on the shirt, just so I could get the mapping in a place that made sense. So I could then take a tileable texture, so I found just a wood bark tileable texture that I replaced from the brick texture. So I used that brick texture again to get orientation and everything right of a tileable. Threw that in there with the wood bark, and then I plugged the wood bark into a bump node, and it just adds a little bit of extra grit and texture to that wood surface. And that's basically as far as I ended up going with the hat. I'm pretty happy with it where it ended up. It does feel pretty wooden, like a painted wooden sculpture, and that's what I wanted out of that. Now I'm just messing with some of the posing, even though I really had a lot of it knocked out in Nomad. Once you get to that final product, you can always just hop in with a sculpt tool, like a grab brush or a move tool, and move things around just to get a little bit more oomph in that, more emphasis in the pose. Played around with the look of the pupils. Sometimes I like to lose the highlights. Sometimes I like to have fake highlights, and sometimes I like to have realistic ones. So here I went with the more realistic looking highlights. Looking for some extra elements just to fill around the space near the feet. So this is a shell that came in the Mossify plugin. And again, the Mossify or add-on. Mossify, you don't have to use it as Moss. You can just use these individual elements. Again, there's so much value in what's available there. So he's got all these pre-built models that again are all built off geometry nodes. So you can go in the attributes and just tweak them to get each prop, even if you're just using one individual prop, to get it the way, get it to look the way you want it to. So tweaking some lights just to get a little bit more highlight on that top bit. So I messed with adding a point light. Again, these are just really minor tweaks at this point. One of the things that I don't have a video of that you will see is I decided to go in and actually paint a kind of a Polynesian tattoo on his fingers with HP for Hawaiian Punch. So I do that. Oh, this is me using the compositing nodes to get some glare into the final render, which is some glow. So you can see it kind of gives that that nice ethereal bloom to it. But anyways, I wanted to add in a Polynesian tattoo. So what I did is I took the render, I went and took that render into Procreate on the iPad and drew the tattoo as a layer on top. Then I pulled that tattoo back into Blender and I used it just with a projection node on the hands, so I could get that tattoo almost like a decal right where I wanted it, and it lined up pretty easily that way. There's a lot of fun you can have with some of the compositing nodes. So I used this lens distortion to get a little bit of fringing, lens fringing around the edges too. And also like to mess with the Kuwahara, which it gives it sort of a painterly look. I have it just dialed in just slightly. I don't know how much of a difference it makes. Again, at this point, it's just minutia that I'm just playing around with just for fun. But with that, that's basically the illustration, and I'll show you that final illustration and pan that here in the video. Stay tuned, because the next thing I'm going to do is really cool. I'm going to put this illustration onto my Looking Glass device, which is a hologram lenticular display. And it's cool because then I can I put a lot of my art on this, so you can show it off, and it's a 3D portrait of the work. Really easy to go from a final Blender render into Looking Glass. So I'm going to do a very short video on how to do that, and I hope you'll check it out. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments below what you think. If you like the illustration, if you like this sort of format of me explaining how I do these, or if you have any questions on how I went about creating this image. And other than that, I will catch you in the next video.